My sermon text this morning will be our gospel lesson, which we heard from Luke chapter 16. If you want to open your Bible there, I'm going to kind of bounce around a little bit. It's not going to be as much of a verse-by-verse sermon, but you can certainly look down at the page as we are there in Luke chapter 16, the last half of that chapter. Now, our Old Testament lesson from Amos, it began with these words: "Woe to those who are at ease." I was reflecting upon this again yesterday morning as I sat with my legs up the entire day watching soccer. It was a really good day. I haven't done that in quite a while. Woe to those who are at ease. It goes on to say, "Woe to those who sleep on unbelievably ornate beds, who sit upon fine couches, who eat lamb and beef, who listen to idle music, who drink wine from bowls, instead of grieving when your brother is ruined." So someone who you know and you live with is ruined right in front of your face. Instead of grieving, they throw a party without him. They are at ease. This is what the prophet Amos said. St. Paul said to Timothy, and we heard this even last Sunday as we were reflecting on the feast of St. Matthew. This is from 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 17. "As for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, to be higher than others, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life." Now, our lectionary has been in Luke all summer. It's been in Luke. Year C, I know it's coming every year, and I should have seen this coming, but my attention is different this year, and for various reasons. As soon as our vestry received a letter of about a 3-month timeline to decide whether or not we want to purchase this building which we rent, and we've been called to be stewards of this building. It is not our possession, but we were asked to consider whether or not we should purchase this building or else find another home. Nearly every lesson has been, in the last month or so, about inheritance or stewardship or renouncing everything, about hospitality and about giving to the poor. And even outside of the normal course of Year C and all the lectionary readings from Luke, out of our Sunday lessons, the last 2 Sundays, we celebrated other holy days. We were read for a couple of Sundays. 2 Sundays ago, Jesus invited us to renounce everything: mother and father and money and brother and sister, to open our hands, renounce everything and give everything away and take hold of the holy cross of martyrdom. That was 2 Sundays ago. Last Sunday, we celebrated the holy day for St. Matthew. So even out of this Year C rhythm, yet another reminder that what we do with our wealth really, really matters, as St. Matthew had to count at the beginning of his following Jesus. Like the divided nation of Israel and Judah in Amos's day, we too, all of us, we live in a decadent age, a present age, the Apostle Paul said, hundreds of years after the days of Amos, a decadent nation, and yes, even in West Virginia, decadence. In the middle of the 4th century, St. John Chrysostom, you guys know my favorite saint. I'm going to give a little bit of biography this morning before I lean on him quite heavily this morning. John Chrysostom was born into a decadent age. He was born just a few years after Constantine had established Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. So it's the middle of the 4th century, around 350. And he lived in a prosperous trade city called Antioch in the east. It's called Antioch. It was wealthy. It was multicultural with a variety of religions as well as many race courses, he says, in many different places and theaters and all these sorts of things. Now, later in his life, in a sermon on Matthew's Gospel, Chrysostom would make comment about Antioch. He said about 1/10 of the city were rich and 1/10 were poor, and everyone else had more than enough. Everyone else in the middle had more than enough. It sounds very common to what many people say in our present day, in our present nation. Now, in his 20s, John Chrysostom, he left Antioch, and probably after his dad died when he was very young, and his mom had probably already died. So he left Antioch, and he settled in a holler outside of town. That's another way of saying in the woods, somewhere in the middle of nowhere. And he spent 4 years with an old Syrian. And so this is where the Roman Empire and the Greco-Roman culture was meeting with the east of Syria, an old Syrian Christian monk. For 4 years, he was with him in a holler outside of Antioch. And after that, he lived alone in a cave for 2 years. And after 2 years of living alone in a cave, he had to return to the city because he was so hungry. One scholar says this: for the next 20 years, Chrysostom served the church of Antioch as a reader first, and then as a deacon and priest. In his years as a reader and deacon, he must have come to know the people of the city as he assisted in liturgical worship, collected and distributed alms, and helped to instruct the catechumens. On January 2nd, 388, so we don't really know when he was actually born, so he's about my age, probably 38-ish, something like that, a few years younger than me maybe. After the riotous celebrations of Saturnalia, which happened on June 1st or even weeks before that, which was a Roman festival where even slaves got to take a week off work, and sometimes in some households, slaves would even be seated at the head of the table, and masters would sit at the foot of the table and serve their slaves. So this is a pagan Roman holiday. A day after this celebration, the beginning of the civil year, Chrysostom began a 5-week series of sermons on our text, on the rich man and Lazarus from Luke chapter 16. And here's how his first sermon began on that day, January 2nd, 388. Yesterday, he said, although it was a feast day of Satan, you preferred to keep a spiritual feast, receiving our words with great goodwill and spending most of the day here in church, drinking a drunkenness of self-control. And I want to write like that someday. Drinking a drunkenness of self-control, he said to his fellow Christians there, gathered on the Lord's Day, and dancing in the chorus of Paul. I love that. Now we must proceed, he said, to the condemnation of luxurious living. This is how he began that first sermon, as was the Antiochian practice. So the church there in Antioch, he spent the first 4 sermons slowly walking verse by verse through this parable. So he covered a quarter of the parable on one Sunday, and then a week later another quarter, and then another quarter, and then another quarter. And then on the 5th Sunday, he summarized everything that came before. So the first month of the year, of that Roman year, he preached on this parable. And a year later, after a massive earthquake in Antioch caused great devastation, he preached another 2 more sermons on this parable. 7 sermons in 2 years. 7 sermons in 2 years. John didn't call, in any of these sermons, he didn't call the Antiochian Christians to renounce everything and to follow him in his asceticism into the monastic wilderness, into his former monastic life where he was so austere that he had to come back to the city because he was starving to death. He didn't call them to that.
He would have loved for his church to return to the apostolic practice. He's preaching years later from the Acts of the Apostles. He would have loved them to return to the apostolic practice of holding everything in common, all of their possessions in common. But he realized that his people were not ready for such a radical change. And so graciously and pastorally, he addressed them as those who must find a way of living as a Christian way of living in the world. Not out in the wilderness by yourself, but in the world. This is where he was preaching. And so for a month, for hours each Sunday, he preached from Luke chapter 16. We don't have that kind of attention span anymore. We don't have it. I would love just to read one of those sermons here this morning, even the shortest one. The congregation would often interrupt him with cheers. I've never had that happen to me before. That's pretty interesting. And they would then leave, many of them would leave in the middle of the service, which it was the ancient tradition that after the liturgy of the word, before they came to the liturgy of the table, anyone who wasn't baptized, in other words, all those who were in the catechumenate, who were preparing for holy baptism, would actually exit the service. They wouldn't just refrain from the table, they would leave the service. And many of them who were already baptized followers, who just came to hear John preach a great oration, would leave. They would leave. He lamented that even as they cheered his oratory, most did not put into practice anything he exhorted them to. Anything. Do not spend more on yourself than is necessary, Chrysostom said. Look, see those in need around you. And to paraphrase, give more. Open your hand a little bit more and more every day. Not to monastic everything, but just more every day, he said. Luke chapter 15, just before our gospel lesson, it ends with these famous words, and these after another famous parable that only shows up in Luke's gospel. Your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. This is at the end of the parable of the prodigal son. And a few verses after this, just before our gospel lesson, Jesus says, you cannot serve God and money. And the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, Luke says, who were lovers of money, heard all these things, and they ridiculed Jesus. This is the context. They ridiculed Jesus, even if they saw their dead brother rise from the dead. They would not believe. Even if they saw the brother who was dead and is now alive, they would not believe like the older brother. If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if Jesus tells parable after parable, warning them against not inviting the poor to the feast, as he's been doing for days and days and weeks and months and months. Neither would they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. This is where our text begins. Our text begins with a rich man. We don't know the name of the rich man in our parable, and this is remarkable. It's remarkable. People in every age, it doesn't matter if it's St. Paul's day or Amos's day or in our day or in Chrysostom's day, they pay attention to the names of the rich and the powerful. Don't you know that's what we do? That's what they do. They write biographies about kings and powerful people. The news is about people who are noteworthy, not people who are nameless on the side. We celebrate those with millions of followers. Everyone knows their name. And so we're very much like they were in the first century. In every age, we buy their books. They speak at conferences. They wear robes, even like the Pharisees or like me on the Lord's Day. Over and over again, the beloved physician Luke, in his gospel, he names not the rich, but the poor. It's pretty cool. We don't know the rich man's name at the beginning of this parable, but we know Lazarus. And if you've been at church for a few days, you've heard this guy's name, Lazarus. Luke is clear. The rich man was not condemned for his riches, no. He was condemned for the things done and left undone. And specifically the things done with his money and the things left undone with his money. He spent his money, Jesus says, on extravagant clothing, not on necessities, not on his daily bread. Every day was luxurious feasts, Jesus says, instead of daily necessity. Sounds familiar. St. Ambrose said that not all poverty is holy. Not all poverty is holy, or all riches criminal, but as luxury, hear this, as luxury disgraces riches, so does holiness commend poverty. Luxury, not riches in itself, but the exorbitant spending of money upon myself at the expense of everyone around me, and poverty, but not poverty in itself, but with holiness of character. The nameless rich man spent all his money, Jesus says, on extravagance, things he didn't need. He didn't see, the text says, the basic needs of Lazarus right in front of him as a part of his household. He was right there every day in front of him. It's interesting, the dogs noticed Lazarus' needs. They met his needs, even as they meet their own needs, and they lick away infection. They cleaned his wounds. They cleaned his wounds and his sores as the rich man focused entirely upon himself. And this, I think it absolutely should it should draw your attention to another parable, or at least another story from Matthew and Mark's gospel of a Syrophoenician woman, or else a Canaanite woman, who was like a Gentile dog, maybe, who was not so worthy as to gather up the crumbs under your table, but you are the same Lord who always desires to show mercy. And Matthew says, and this is the only time this phrase is used in the New Testament, you have great faith, to this Gentile woman. Luke, for whatever reason, doesn't include that story. Matthew and Mark do, and neither do Matthew and Mark include this story. Luke says that Lazarus desired, and you can hear the language of this Gentile Syrophoenician or else Canaanite woman. He desired to be fed from the rich man's table, even as he took the place of the dogs. His faith, clearly, is commended before the master's table. He's commended for his poverty. The parable goes on, and we know this parable. I'm not going to rehearse it verse by verse for 4 weeks, okay, or 5 weeks, or even 7 weeks. Both men died. That's how this parable goes. Lazarus died in faith, and he rested, and the nameless rich man died just as he lived. Everyone knew his name on earth, and he was instantly forgotten, which is true over and over again throughout the history of the world. He was cut off from all compassion and care and generosity in this life. He didn't do any of those things, and therefore he was cut off from all compassion and care in his death. One of my favorite sections from C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, he says this: what is the good of saying you are on Jesus' side when he comes in judgment? What is the good in saying that you're on his side when he comes in judgment? For at that time, Lewis says, at that time, he will be God without disguise. Everyone will know exactly who they're dealing with, something so overwhelming that it will strike either irresistible love or irresistible horror on that day. There will be no use saying you choose to lie down when it has become impossible to stand up. That's what's happening right here in our text. On that day, when God is everything is clear. Everything is clear. Jesus is revealed in his glory where nobody, whether they love him or they're terrified by him, will be able to stand. It's no good you saying, well, I'm humbling myself now. Well, the rich man sees clearly that he is cut off from all love, and Jesus says that he is in torment. He now sees Lazarus. He did not see him. But now he sees Lazarus, but Lazarus is no longer near. He is far off, and the man whom he did not see when he was at his door, he was near to him in life, and he didn't see him. And now that there is an uncrossable chasm, Jesus says, it's uncrossable. It's so far apart between them. Now he can see him, but it's too late. Chrysostom says in his sixth homily, and this was right after the great earthquake in Antioch a year later, he said this: both men departed to that place where everything is true. They were there where everything is true. The stage sets were removed and the masks were taken off. That's where they're at. And so, understandably, he cries out, I know it's too late for me, but send Lazarus to my family. Father, send Lazarus to my family. Tell them not to neglect the poor while there is still time. And Jesus responds to this appeal in the parable. They have already heard this message. They've heard this message just as you did countless times. Moses said, open your hand freely to the poor. From Deuteronomy 15 and in countless other ways. Amos said, stop trampling the head of the poor into the dust. Isaiah said, share your bread with the hungry. I'm not saying anything different. And even in this Saturnalia holiday, this pagan holiday, that for a moment, even culturally recognizes the value of this. I'm not saying anything new. And I'm certainly not saying anything more than what the law and the prophets said. I am doing what God has always done. I am saying what God has always said. Not one dot of the law is now void, he says right before our text. And even if I send them someone from the place of the dead, they will not listen. Even if they hear for a moment, he says elsewhere, if they go on their way saying, relax, eat, drink, and be merry, they are choked by the cares and riches and pleasures of life, and their fruit does not mature. They're choked up. I don't know where you are at this morning. I know where I was on my couch yesterday as I read Amos talking about comfy couches, and I love my comfy couch. Maybe this is the kind of question that might be ringing in your ear. Are you among the wealthiest 1% of people in the world? Or maybe you're thinking, I'm an outcast and forgotten poor West Virginian. Depends on how you look at it. Is your house smaller than your neighbor's house? Your job more money or less money than someone else next to you? Do you drive by countless homeless poor every day as I do, or do you live in a place where you don't have to see them? Are you generous or are you stingy? Rich or poor, and there's a bunch of different ways that it gets into our lives. Rich or poor, are you mastered by money? Does money consume your every thought? Are you afraid? Are you worried about daily bread, about your future security? Are you covered in sores and hungry? And even there, by faith, like Lazarus, are you rejecting the self-indulgence of despair even in your poverty? Are you rich and generous, resisting the temptation of wealth to be haughty, which it does in every age? In your wealth, do you recognize the uncertainty of riches? And rather than, because it's so uncertain, do you store up more riches for yourself and for your 5 brothers and your family and your household and those nearest to you? Or are you generous and ready to share, storing up treasures in heaven? I don't know where you are at this morning. And maybe you're like me often when you hear something like this and you hear questions like this. Ooh, they really need to hear this. That person whom I covet, they need to hear this. There are 2 ways before us in this. There's one of life and one of death, and there is a great difference between the 2 ways. There are 2 ways before us this morning. This is how the first century catechism, the Didache, begins. 2 ways, life and death before us. The first thing the catechism says is the way of life is, as we began this service, it's loving God and neighbor. Who is my neighbor? Yeah, all of them. Loving God and neighbor. It goes quickly on to the second way of life is blessing those who curse you. The third thing this catechism, this late first century catechism said, 250 years before Chrysostom, the way of life is to abstain from bodily lust. The fourth thing it says is the way of life is giving money away without asking for money in return. And the fifth, let thine alms sweat into thine hands. Let your money that you're giving away, let it sweat into your hands until you have learned to whom to give. This is how the way of life and the way of death was taught in the very first century. And I hear the it's the 6th. Now I'm remembering. It's the 6th sermon from John Chrysostom, and he asked this question. When you were living in your wealth, when you were free to see at your own will, you did not choose to see him. Why do you have such keen sight now? Where are your cupbearers? Where are your flatterers? Where is your vanity? Where is your presumption? Where is your buried gold? Where are your moth-eaten garments? Where is the silver which you valued so highly? Where are your ostentation and your luxury? They are leaves. They are leaves. Winter seized them, and they all withered up. They are a dream, and when day came, the dream departed. They were a shadow. The truth came, and the shadow fled away. And so Chrysostom invites his parish and us here this morning, when we hear this parable, let us fear the Lord, my beloved, lest we also see the poor and pass them by, lest instead of Lazarus alone, there be many to accuse us hereafter. Christ is risen from the dead. This is how the parable ends. They will not believe even if they see someone risen from the dead. And so hear the gospel according to Luke, in the context of this parable here this morning. Christ is risen from the dead to save you from the torments of hell and to save you from the torments of luxurious living. Those go together. Of excess. Christ is risen from the dead to fulfill everything that Moses wrote. Not one jot or tittle goes away. Oh, that's just in the Old Testament. Christ is risen from the dead to confirm everything that Paul and Amos and Malachi and Isaiah and I would say John Chrysostom proclaimed to deaf ears, people who walked out in the middle of the service in the dying embers of divided Israel, where the south no longer cared for their brother to the north. And Amos rebukes them. In the crumbling walls of a pleasure-seeking Roman Empire that would become nothing in a few hundred years. In the addicted depression of luxurious America, Christ is risen from the dead. Not one iota will pass away. He is risen from the dead. Follow him this morning. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter how much you have. Kids, hear me. Give. Give. See needs around you, those who are nearest to you, not people far away from you on TikTok, but people next to you. See those needs and meet them financially, with your time, with your care, with your love. Many of you kids are really good at this, but it's really easy to pay attention to things far away from us and not to those right in front of our face. Give of yourself. Give of your time and your talent and your treasure, all of these things. It doesn't matter what neighborhood you live in. Give more and more away every day. Open your hand more and more. Do not be haughty. Do not get more than you need, but give. This is the invitation of Jesus. It's the invitation of Luke. It's the invitation of the gospel. Do good, Paul says. Do good. Be rich in good works. Be generous and ready to share. Store up treasure for yourself as a good foundation for the future today. Not some future day when you won't have a choice anymore. Today, take hold of that which is truly life. Don't wait. Don't have to be afraid. Christ is risen from the dead. Pursue the way of life today. Another way to say this is follow the way of generosity and give more and more away. Live the way of faithful Lazarus. Even in your poverty, don't despair, but cast your cares upon the Lord, storing up treasures in heaven. And ultimately and finally at the end of this parable and at the end of this gospel, follow the cross. Even as we followed the cross here in this morning, as we came into worship, and as we go out into all of our lives following the cross, follow the way of the cross of Jesus, die, be martyred with him, and live. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.